Hey, I'm Brian, and this is going to be a little bit of a different video, a little more podcast style, but I think this topic is very important. I first didn't want to talk about the new European Copyright Directive because not only do I think that the directive has gotten out of control, the debate about it has too. There has been a lot of misinformation by people from YouTube, people from the EU institutions, and other actors, so I just wanted to clarify a few things in this video. So what are we actually talking about here? We're talking about and I quote, proposal for a directive of the European Parliament and of the Council on copyright in the digital single market. And these words are important. It's a proposal for a directive. It's not yet a law. This is important because it means that it's not concrete yet, and it can still change, and we can still influence the direction in which it is going. So if it's not a law yet, then what's the process of it becoming law eventually? Well, it's still being negotiated between the Parliament, the first legislative body, the Council, the second legislative body, and the Commission, the executive. They're going to meet again on the 14th of January for a so-called trilogue meeting, where members from all the three institutions bring in their positions on what they want the directive to say and agree on one final wording. So far, the Parliament only voted on their position in these negotiations, so the document that got out of that vote is not actually the final directive. So we cannot conclusively say what it's going to do. Most people say they have until the 18th of March to come to an agreement because they want to pass this directive before the next European elections in May. And then, probably after the 18th of March, we're going to have another vote in Parliament where they're going to either accept or reject this directive. But since at that point there was already a lot of renegotiation and changing of the wording, the chances of this getting rejected at that point are very slim. After this, the directive will come into effect, and the member states have up to 2 years to put it into national law. And this usually takes that long, because governments procrastinate just as much as we private people do. This is probably going to be the same as with GDPR, which was also passed over 2 years ago, just no one did anything to implement it until last year. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that because of this, the UK will probably not be affected any more than any other non-EU member state, since they will leave the European Union before they will need to implement this into their national law. For the other countries, in the worst case, we have 2 years of time to arrange ourselves with the consequences if nothing changes in the proposal. And YouTube actually acknowledged this on Twitter, that YouTube isn't going to come to an end in 2019, basically for sure. And, hopefully, but most definitely, the proposal will change. There has been some criticism for the vagueness of the proposal, but for now, it's only a proposal. And even the directive in the end can be a little vague, because it's up to member states on how they interpret it for their national law. They just follow the guidelines that the directive sets. But because of how the EU works, they can't just not do this. It's legally binding. They have to implement it into national law in some way, shape, or form. So now that we have the process of how this will develop, what does Article 13 actually say right now? I'm going to quote this. Information society service providers that store and provide to the public access to large amounts of works or other subject matter uploaded by their users shall, in cooperation with right holders, take measures to ensure the functioning of agreements concluded with right holders for the use of their works or other subject matter, or to prevent the availability on their services of works or other subject matter identified by right holders through the cooperation with the service providers. Those measures, such as the use of effective content recognition technologies, shall be appropriate and proportionate, and so on and so on. You can read the whole article, which is linked in the description by yourself. It might be a bit hard to understand what it says in full, but it's right now actually kind of more important what it doesn't say. It only talks about uploads, not deletions of existing content, and it doesn't outlaw YouTube or anything. So you don't really need to panic because the EU institution's goal isn't to destroy the internet. I think some people got a wrong impression there. But of course, what is problematic is that this wording could have some unintended consequences. More to that in a bit. But how is copyright handled on YouTube right now? Right now we have a so-called notice and takedown system. This means that once someone notices a copyright violation on YouTube, they report that violation to YouTube, which can then take care of the problem by either holding the creator accountable or taking the video down. But experts say that this new wording in Article 13 will make platforms liable not only if they do not take down or pass on the problem onto their respective channel on notice, but also when they tolerate a copyrighted upload. To prevent this, quote, information society service providers that store and provide to the public access to large amounts of works or other subject matter uploaded by their users shall use, quote, effective content recognition technologies that, quote, shall be appropriate and proportionate. And these information society service providers are platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and so on. So yes, other platforms are affected in the same way. But it's not nonprofits like Wikipedia or small community forums. Those were excluded in an amendment. So what are effective content recognition technologies that shall be appropriate and proportionate? Well, what this is talking about is something like Content ID, a filter for copyrighted material, if you will. And while it doesn't explicitly mention the word filter anymore, because the wording was changed after a huge outcry about the consequences of filters, which I'm now going to talk about, a lot of people still agree that the only effective content recognition technology is a filter. Technically, this sounds good, because this is the big problem with the notice and takedown system. Right now, you have to notice that someone is getting rich from your work and has stolen it in order to keep them from doing that. And you lose basically the money that they have gained from uploading it until you noticed it. This would basically eliminate that problem. But there is one important deficiency in these filters. They are imperfect. And this is actually kind of the core problem of this whole article. People in the EU institutions think these filters work very well, but they don't. So YouTube says, and they probably know the best what their filters can and can't do, that the filters would need to be proactive to block more content than they would necessarily have to, so YouTube can't get sued. Because if they're not proactive, they might have too much of a risk of stuff slipping through and YouTube being held accountable. YouTube says that this could also include content for educational uses, parodies, and memes, which are technically supposed to be unaffected. So the parliament has actually acknowledged that memes could be affected by this wording and put an amendment in place so that shouldn't happen. I say shouldn't, because overall this is a very valid concern and could lead to limited content. YouTube is even saying that they might have to block uploads altogether because even the proactive filter could have stuff slip through. But as far as I understand it, this is actually very far from the truth, and I'm going to go into detail on why more later. And Article 13 also demands that platforms put in place a system so people can dispute possible false positives in the filter system. Another concern some people have in regards to these filters is that once they're in place, they could be used for political censorship. But how I read the law, this wouldn't necessarily be made legal by it and still be illegal even if Article 13 comes in place. So I don't think that their goal is to politically censor with hopefully no one noticing. But apart from these filters, the directive also mentions a second option, and this is agreements concluded with right holders. YouTube could buy licenses so that content wouldn't be blocked. Given the right licenses, this could, even if that's unlikely that YouTube would want to pay for this, even allow whole movies to be uploaded to YouTube. Another good example of this is the German GEMA case, where music was blocked for years because YouTube refused to pay the right holders. Now they do, and it's fine, you can watch music videos on YouTube in Germany. What is a valid criticism though is that YouTube could never make agreements with all right holders to not get sued. Agreements with big networks could be made, but not with every amateur photographer that could technically sue YouTube for their work being used. This would just be too much bureaucracy. So as you can see, this seems like a good intention with unintended consequences. And these need to be eliminated in the process, otherwise we really could have a problem. But people in the EU institutions are listening, and the proposal of the Council, again like the second legislative body, looks a lot more promising. It says that the platforms will not be liable if they did everything that one could expect of them to prevent copyrighted content existing without a license. So as long as they make license agreements, which again is encouraged so we can have more available content, and they make their filter system better, things that slip through would still use the notice and takedown system. This seems pretty acceptable to me, but we'll see where the final form ends up between this and the proposal that I talked about before. And it is important to mention that the filters that this council proposal mentions are still subject to the same issues that I talked about before. I want to stress again though that technically it is not a bad idea to encourage platforms to make more license agreements and make their filter systems better, because right now Content ID is very imperfect. But what you also have to understand is that this whole thing is a lot about money and lobbying, as always. The right holders want money for their work, so they lobby in Brussels, a haven for lobbyists by the way, to get that through. But YouTube, on the other hand, and this is something talked about a lot here in Europe, but not elsewhere I find, also doesn't want to pay. Even in the council form, this is going to cost YouTube a lot of money for better filters and licenses. So what YouTube did with their hashtag Save the Internet campaign is also encouraging creators to lobby for them so they don't have to pay as much. And this is all while saying they just altruistically want to do good for creators, and that's really just half the truth. Of course, spreading awareness for the unintended consequences is important, but YouTube doesn't just want to save creators. This is something that goes back to the Gamer case where YouTube refused to pay, and by that accepted that content of their creators would be blocked. So they don't always want the best for us either. A lot of what Susan Wojcicki said isn't wrong, but it's just half the truth. They acknowledged this in a Twitter feed too, which I'll have linked below, where they backtrack a lot from saying that they would have to block EU creators outright to only saying some content might be affected. And here again, they talked about parodies and such, which would still be perfectly legal, but again, could be affected through those proactive filters as an unintended consequence. And lastly, people in the EU institutions are also only telling half the truth when they answer on Twitter and say that nothing will change. That might be their intention, but because the text isn't final, we can't conclusively say that yet. So what do I think? Will YouTube block channels and videos in the EU? No. The European market is just too important for them. And especially if the final form is more close to the Council's proposal, that would just be a move I would not see as favorable to the community, even if it does save them money. But if they're truly liable for everything that is uploaded to YouTube, it's really up to YouTube themselves to calculate the risk, which might have unintended consequences we all don't want. And while I do think it's right to use all possibilities to raise awareness so this moves in the right and not in the wrong direction, you should just be mindful to not spread any false information. Because this is something that I've seen by another creator who isn't from Europe, and all I can say to that is that you shouldn't really judge something if you don't know how it works. And this is also a good thing to mention too, if you're living outside of the EU, all of this will affect you too. Maybe not the potential blocking, but definitely the filters and licensing agreements. Because, and this has been said, it will affect all content viewable in the European Union, not necessarily just creators in the European Union. This is also why upload blocking wouldn't necessarily be something I see YouTube doing. Finally, I want to stress again that nothing is final and we still have time, and honestly, until it's final, we don't really need to panic. With GDPR, we saw that sometimes there's a lot of panic around a thing that doesn't end up being that bad. And if you want to tell the members of the European Parliament what you think, you can sign a petition that's linked in the video description below, or you can call your constituency's MEP if you live within the European Union to tell them personally what you think, so they hopefully vote for the right thing. Both of those things are again linked below, along with tons of other reading material and access to the original documents and the trilogue outcomes. So, if you enjoyed this video, you know which buttons to press, and don't forget to press that follow button on Twitter. I'm Brian, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.